Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Khaled and I will be your host for this session. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, How to Set Up Platforms to Deliver Grants and Microcredits to Those Impacted by COVID-19. The session will be presented by Pratibha, Jain, Richie, Sancheti, Meyyappan, N, Rahul, Rishi, and our guest speakers for the today, Amit, Bhatia, Joy Mishra, Rahil, Rangwala, and Mr. Ramraj. Please note that this session will be in listen-only mode and will last for about 60 minutes, of which first 30 to 40 minutes will be spent on panel discussion. The remaining time will be available for Q&A. Requesting all the participants to be on the mute mode for this session. You can post your questions in the chat window while the panel discussion is on. The moderator will queue up the questions for the speakers accordingly. Should you need any assistance during the conference call, you can use the chat option. Do note the conference is being recorded. I now welcome our session presenter, Pratibha Jain, who heads NDA's Delhi office, Richie Sancheti, head investment fund formation practice, Meyyappan N, leads the impact investment and social finance practice, and Rahul Rishi is a senior member of our corporate sector practice. Our guest speakers for the day, Mr. Amit Bhatia is the CEO of GSG or Global Steering Group for Impact Investment since April 2017. Prior to GSG, Amit was the founding CEO of India's Impact Investors Council. Amit is the founder of Aspire, the John P. McNulty Prize-winning social enterprise for education and training. Amit quit a successful corporate career in 2007 to serve the social sector. He was CEO of WNS Knowledge Services, India's first outsourcing company to list NYSE, and most notably founder of McKinsey Knowledge Center, a consulting firm's global research center. Joy Mishra, Director and Head Legal at Uber, South Asia and India. Mr. Mishra is an experience in advising on navigating challenging regulatory landscape, complex structured transactions, product and complex multi-judicial mergers and acquisitions, and private equity transactions. Mr. Rahil Rangwala, Director of India Programs at Michael and Suzanne Dell Foundation. Rahil is the Director of Family Economic Stability Team in India and oversees the foundation's investment in the financial inclusion and livelihood sector. He spent over 7 years at Bridgewater Associates, a global micro hedge fund, before making the transition to the development sector. Mr. Ramraj is a Chief Executive Officer at India Impact Investors Council. He has been a credit market specialist with specialization in the financial services and inclusion related issues before joining IIC. Ramraj served as the president of CRISIL Limited for 24 years. Over to you, Ms. Pratibha.
Thank you, Khaled. And thank you everyone for joining us today for, again, a very important topic that for the last couple of weeks, we at NDA have been brainstorming on, essentially how to address what the capital needs of the SME segment and the individuals would be given the hardships that have been imposed on both businesses and individuals post-COVID. Even before the lockdown started, the Indian economy was facing a liquidity crunch due to high NPAs at NBFCs due to their real estate exposure. And this was post the high NPAs already at banks. So we already going into COVID with a liquidity crunch in the economy. In that scenario, it will become very important as we figure out a way out of the current health crisis. How do we get the wheels churning? And before that, how do we ensure that there is some liquidity in the hands of individuals and businesses? We already had 2 sessions, one last week on fintech and financial inclusion, looking at how the technology space along with the fintech solutions that are already there in the market can help with financial inclusion. And before that, just understanding the needs of the impact investors and NGOs in terms of the kind of legal structures they would need to be able to make grants and investments in the country. Today, we are going to look at specifically how to create structures to provide more of microcredit lending structures in the market post-COVID or immediately after these lockdowns are over. We have a great panel of guests and NDAs who've been working on this issue. Let me just start straight with Joy Mishra, who's joined us here from Uber. He heads legal for Uber. And as everybody can imagine, Uber has a captive group of people who will need this help. The drivers that provide services to Uber. Joy, I'm sure you're thinking about, how to help them. And we've had a few discussions on these. So I will first hand it over to you to understand, what are the issues that you see them facing, and then, help us think through some of the solutions you've thought through about the issue.
Sure. Thanks, Pratibha. Good evening to everyone. So, Pratibha, as you rightly said, I think we are sort of touch lives in a very different manner. One of the ways in which we touch lives.
We cannot hear you. Can you be louder? A little bit?
Sure.
Thank you.
Is this better?
Yeah, this is better. Yeah, much better.
So, Pratibha, you're right. I mean, I think we touch lives in very many different ways. One set that we really touch are the micro entrepreneurs on our platform, which are our driver partners. Now, what we have really seen is that unless urgent steps are taken, this particular healthcare crisis can very quickly degenerate into a humanitarian crisis. Why do we say so? If I look at, I think it's useful for everybody on the call to just get a little lay of the land of what constitutes a driver partner on a platform like Uber. Unlike in several other parts of the world, especially the Western world, folks on Uber platform or ride-sharing platform in India or South Asia region are not here to supplement their income. This is their income. So because of COVID and because of the lockdown, which while necessary, what that has resulted in is a complete shut-off of their earnings avenues. So here are families, people who are completely dependent on money to come in to pay for their families, and very importantly, their EMIs that the cars that they put up on the platform. And so they were faced with a scenario of overnight having some sort of a stable earning, absolutely getting into absolute penury, which by itself, if not addressed quickly, will, as I said, lead to a humanitarian crisis. So, what are the various ways in which people are thinking about this? I think early on, as the crisis sort of started up, we started talking with the government in trying to see what are the interventions that we can have at a very policy level. Like one of the things we talked about, and later we were pleasantly sort of taken in to see the RBI governor echoing our views, in which we definitely asked the government for an EMI moratorium. While the moratorium which the RBI has announced may not be a perfect solution, but it does give some breathing space. There were some welfare schemes that the government came out, talked about direct benefit transfers, all of which was stuff that we were talking to the government. The other thing that we've tried to do is try and spin up, and I think only a company like Uber, I'm very proud to say, can probably do that, is immediately go down into still day one mode and spring up new lines of businesses over a week. So we basically came out with 4 different lines of businesses in a span of 7 days, from moving what matters, essentials, the goods, to hiring frontline healthcare workers. And as a company, we took a stance that we will not charge a commission during this period, and sort of try and see how much we can engage our people in getting some earnings. The third, and the one that we have been talking a lot with you guys about, NDA, and thanks a lot to all the donors who worked on the project, was the grant or relief fund that we have been set up. There were various ideas that we had, and we thought there is something that we need to do to provide immediate relief in relation to sustenance. Nothing but at least, as we would say in Hindi, probably roti chawal to mil jaye. So we wanted to at least put in in the bank accounts of our driver partners at least that much money, which buys food for a family of 4 for a month, at the least that much. And that is the reason why Uber started setting up a fund where we took advice from you, partnered with Give India, Meyyappan, and Sancheti. Uber has put in a seed grant of about $3 million as we speak today. It has already gone to the accounts of about 70,000 driver partners. And at least we've been able to serve them in some ways. It's open for contribution and donation to our riders, to general public, for people all around the world. And we do believe that there is a unique proposition in the terms that everybody around the world and in this country have in some way or the other touched by these people. When we reached out to our riders, and I don't know, some of you may have opened your email accounts, which you use with Uber, you would have found that we would have told you that over the last few months, here are the number of rides that you've taken on Uber, and here are the number of people you've met as driver partners. So contribution from you goes directly to them. We believe that all of you on this call are a part of the extended Uber family, and therefore all of us have that moral obligation to take care of each other during this crisis. And that's really the way in which this grant fund has been structured, and that's the way we really sort of take this forward. We're also working with our financing partners and OEMs to provide specific relief to our driving partners, whether it be through easy scheme loans or through sort of discounting on the equipment that they buy. There is a host of measures that we are really thinking through as a company. So I'll just keep it.
That is wonderful, Joy. In fact, I think, that's the key, is that if each institution does its bit, we all can help overcome at least the immediate crisis. And, it's great work that Uber is doing in that regard. But I think what's more interesting is your partnership. Also, you're thinking long-term, and you're thinking about partnership with impact investors, with grants, with NGOs, grant makers. And that, because, for it to be sustained, this is not a problem that's going to go away in 4 weeks. And, you recognize that in terms of getting them in, I think, and again, where we come in is ensuring that we are providing, and it's great to hear that, you had those conversations with the government, you had, good conversation with RBI and government. They're all doing their bit to try and ease the pain, but if they're talking, the public-private conversation is as important as then leading to those partnerships. But let me just see if I have any of our impact investors on call yet. Do we have Ramraj on call?
Yeah, I'm here, Pratibha. I think Rahil will also be on. You both of us can.
Okay. Wonderful. So Ramraj, if I can just bring you in very quickly to help us just understand, what the Impact Investment Council is thinking about right now with its members, and what sort of initiatives are you seeing coming from them in this regard?
Yeah. Thank you, Pratibha, for this opportunity, and I think it's wonderful to hear what Joy was saying in terms of some of the initiatives that his organization is taking. I think specifically from impact investors, and I'm sure Rahil from Dell Foundation will also speak. But essentially, what we are really thinking about is, I think there is a certain amount of grant funding, or if I may say, donations or philanthropy, which can go to alleviate the immediate impact of some of the challenges that we are seeing in micro enterprises, whether they are informal economy workers or whether they are other micro enterprises. But I think in addition to the immediate sustenance, there is also a need for slightly longer term liquidity finance, which a lot of these enterprises will need. We are also aware that the NBFC sector, which was one of the biggest financiers of a lot of these customers, whether they are the informal economy workers or the micro enterprises, are also facing a challenge at this particular point in time for a variety of reasons, and that's not the focus of the conversation at this point. But I think essentially what we've been thinking is how can we really use what I would call as blended finance kind of techniques, which will use essentially a combination of maybe conventional or grant financing along with commercial debt. So we want commercial debt investors to come in, but obviously commercial debt investors may have a lot of apprehensions at this point. So how can we use maybe some of the grant and concessional money to give them comfort? So we are really thinking of a structure which could be, you could think of very loosely as a two-tiered structure, which would be a senior debt, which could be, if I may say, at commercial rates or at somewhat concessional rates. And you could have a junior structure, which could be grant capital or concessional capital, and essentially create a structure which provides, if I may say, two things. One is obviously provides liquidity to the sector, but at the same time, it also provides support to the senior investor who may have a lot of apprehensions in such a credit shocked economy. So I think the whole idea will be to how to bring together very intelligently grant money, concessional money, and commercial money. Because if we give a grant, if I give a 1 rupee grant, it just goes as a 1 rupee. And I think that's important and that's valuable. But over a period, if I do a two-tiered structure, maybe that 1 rupee of grant will be able to attract another 2-3 rupees of additional commercial capital. And I think the combination can create more impact on the ground. So that's really something we are trying to gain traction around, bring a lot of people to the table. And I think in a nutshell, we are trying to see whether this can become a very substantial kind of a movement, which can enable us to impact a lot many more people after the initial, if I may say, survival issues hopefully go away. They will have to look at the next few months how they are going to sustain, because I do see a lot of these segments go through serious trouble over the next 3 to 4, 5 months, because I think travel, all of this is going to get seriously impacted. So we are not going to see people travel a lot. So, volumes will be down. So they will need funding far beyond the first 2-3 months. So let me stop here, Pratibha, and I think that's the broad thinking we are having. How can we use, combination of commercial capital and grant capital together in this fashion? Yeah, so that's really what I had to say.
Thanks, Ramraj. Rahil, if I can bring you in, I was reading a study done by Bloomberg of some 65 asset managers. This was pre-COVID, which talked about how they would all be interested in participating in the Indian economy, especially rupee debt, but they just needed easing of norms. How do you see that situation changing post-COVID, especially organizations like Dell Foundation, that's going to have, lot of demand globally on the capital you have, and just play that into what Ramraj was talking about, being then able to leverage the grant money with the commercial financing that anyways was interested in coming into India if we can just liberalize a bit.
Thank you. First, I just want to commend you, Pratibha, and your team to just organizing this. I mean, there's so much going on, but what doesn't seem to always happen is sharing of knowledge and information, and we all are operating in our silos. So thank you so much for just taking the time to step back and share all of the work that you're doing and bringing all of us together. So thank you. I really appreciate that. To your question on, I think there's 2 or 3 points you made over there. One is just the interest of participating in the Indian economy from a foreign investor perspective, given the challenges of the regulations. I think that's one. I think the second is how do philanthropic investors or impact investors think about this given the current crisis? I think the first thing is, at least from an impact investor perspective, India has always been a huge portfolio allocation for a lot of impact investors. It's one of the most energetic and lively markets in terms of opportunity from an investment perspective. So there has been a lot of interest that interest from an impact investor perspective has predominantly been driven by equity, I would say. Debt has been very challenging. In fact, we struggled to, since 2011, we've been looking at ways to and thinking of how do we crack that, because the need for capital is in so many silos and so many places that debt is the one thing that most startups and most of the startups in the ecosystem are starved of. And what ends up happening is they use equity instead of debt, which is such a poor use of equity, which really mutes returns, right? So we don't really like that. As investors ourselves, we don't like that. We don't like seeing our portfolio founders using my equity or some equity that they've raised and in sort of a very low return kind of. So that's just been a challenge. But having said that, things have changed since 2011 to now. The debt markets have opened up. You are seeing NCD, ECB. Rules have been changing on us, but they've come back to a sort of common sense, trying to get the activity kickstarted. And I think even now local debt funds are there. So it's really helped a lot. But as you said in your opening remarks, this crisis has really driven liquidity out the window. I think everyone is now just sitting back and trying to understand, what do we do? How do we deploy? Because the pools of capital are now very, very limited. Given the demand we're seeing, what we are sitting on is just a drop in the ocean. Like, we can't even begin to fathom the kind of need that there is on the ground. And I think, to Ramraj's point, a lot of grant makers, a lot of impact investors are recognizing that they have very limited. To begin with, we are very small, right? We always had limited capabilities, but the demand has sort of extrapolated to such a large amount that we are such a small fish over here. So the importance has come into collaborating and leverage. To Ramraj's point, how do we crowd in more capital? How do we solve this problem collaboratively? How do we do it while we're not stepping on each other's toes? I think that's sort of been the mantra that we have been looking at, and working with Impact Investors Council and some other impact investors, foundations, DFIs, thinking about how do we crowd in capital where we can leverage and solve different parts of this problem together. But I'm actually quite hopeful that the allocations for India will continue to be there. I don't think that's changing. I think there's going to be stress on how quickly people can move, because people are asking questions for, are we really making the right choice? At the same time, there's a lot of pressure to move quickly. And our bias, at least at MSTF, is that let's move quickly, but not close any paths for future scale, because we want to keep options open to invite others and work with others as well. So I think that's the bias. We want to sort of keep the action-oriented nature and move quickly and start demonstrating there's impact, but to an eye towards how do we make sure that we're not the only ones doing it, and how do we collaborate with others as well. And that's where, working with Ramraj and the Impact Investors Council has been very helpful.
Thanks, Rahil. That's very useful comments. Good to know that there's still allocation for India. I think that's obviously a big worry for everybody, here. But you're absolutely right. The need for speed is so important in such an environment where the demand for capital is going to be high. How do we ensure that for those who are willing to put in the money, for the likes of Uber, who are trying to facilitate the money being moved, from grant to NGO to impact investors, how do we get that, put in the economy? Let me just quickly bring in the NDA team to just talk about, the structures that are already available. Like you mentioned, Rahil, there was some easing up of the debt route, whether it's the FPI route and doing NCDs through that, but there's still certain restrictions there. Let me bring in Meyyappan from NDA to talk about, and then Richie, maybe you can join into that discussion on what are the structures currently available for for microcredit, especially with impact money and grant money, to be able to fund similar projects or same projects?
Thanks, Pratibha. So I think while Richie will be dealing with a couple of options which probably provide for larger scale and more opportunities to synergize impact capital with grant money and private capital. The first option I think I'll be dealing with is the NBFC structure sort of option where we use the NBFC entity to bring in money from impact investors abroad using the ECB route or the FPI route, and which can then be used for on lending and providing returns. Now, of course, the reason that this is a viable option primarily because, as Rahil was also saying, that this is something that you want to be able to use if you want to respond quickly to the situation on the ground. So from a using an existing infrastructure or a NBFC which is already available to roll out funds quickly once it's in receipt of funds is an advantage. But of course, there are certain considerations that need to be borne in mind when it's from an investor perspective in terms of whether the money is coming in through the ECB route or FPI route. There are certain restrictions around it. There are certain caps. And there may also be, depending on what the end use of the loans are used for by the NBFC and to whom it's given. Some of the restrictions in the ECB guidelines also have to be kept in mind in terms of how long will the money be locked up with the NBFC. And having said that, I think the second part of it was also how do we unlock CSR or grant capital in this sort of a platform. That's something maybe I think Rahul will add to that aspect later, but there are some ways to do it, and it also depends on the ability to implement this on the ground. There could be some operational challenges, but these are all depends on the stakeholders we are talking about and their ability to implement it on ground. But this is one viable option. It's something that we have done in the past, and it is something that the ECB money that's brought into an NBFC has been successfully used to leverage domestic funds and crowd in capital, as Rahil was saying earlier.
Thanks, Pratibha. I think from my perspective, I focus on designing funds and structures so that we can connect the asset allocators or investors who are coming whether from India or overseas, and how they wish to sort of utilize those capital allocations to different opportunities. So I think some of the options which are relevant for our current asset class are a Section 8 company that my colleague Rahul will also be discussing as we go along, the NBFC type model that Meyyappan spoke about, as well as a social venture fund, which is possible under the AI for Jain. Now, as we go on designing the platform, we have to first look at what are these different entities and what are the different kinds of capital that they can absorb. So to begin with, a Section 8 company can receive grants. It can also receive CSR allocations from different Indian corporates who have the bandwidth to allocate those CSR allocations. So this would be an appropriate channel for them to use it. A Section 8 company in certain cases also eligible to issue tax exemption certificates under ATG, which means that any Indian taxpayer could sort of go for a tax exemption on any contributions they make on the back of the ATG sort of a certificate. The Section 8 can in turn issue grants. It can sort of give grants, but it cannot get into a profit motive type situations, which is the limitation on the Section 8. The second aspect is that if a Section 8 is registered under FCRA, it can also absorb foreign grants coming in. NBFC, on the other hand, Meyyappan spoke about, it's a corporate type entity. You may need an FPI license as a overseas investor if you want to sort of subscribe into NCDs, non-convertible debentures, whereas ECB is a slightly more relevant regime for foreign contributors to come in, but it has its own end use and minimum tenure sort of restrictions which sort of come into play. The NBFC, on the other hand, can directly give loans. It could be payable on a weekly, quarterly, monthly, whatever basis. And there are very neat structures which can be designed
by using a combination of NBFC and Section 8s working together, so that the loans can be disbursed to those who are in need of the capital, but at the same time, some sort of corporate guarantee or grant mechanisms can be used so that you could bring in the risk investors and the grantors on a common platform, albeit though not in the same entity, but you can see very interesting uses of combinations on the platform. On the other hand, a social venture fund is a part of category 1 bucket of AIFs, which are recognized by SEBI, the securities regulator, to absorb not just your typical risk investors who may come in for the regular return expectations or muted return expectations, but it can also accept grants and give grants. A social venture fund can make investments or give grants in situations which also include a Section 8 company or a microfinance institution and so on and so forth. Now, interesting issues can come there, that even though SEBI, the securities regulator, recognizes social venture funds to accept grants, but could these SVFs accept foreign grants, which otherwise would have required an FCRA approval? I think there are some gaps in the regulations. Maybe this could be a good situation that we are in. At least that could be one good thing coming out of this, that could we sort of iron out all the creases in our laws so that the social venture fund can sort of come out as a very efficient ways of mixing grantor money and risk and return seeking expectations sort of investors also coming together. But again, these are the three sort of pockets of regimes that can work either in isolation or in combination to come out with an overall platform which can sort of be optimized to meet different investor expectations and also different allocation expectations that those investors may have.
Thanks, Richie. Thanks, Meyyappan. As you guys mentioned, we've actually been asking the government for a while now to allow at least the social venture fund structure or some sort of an AIF structure that will allow you to have an impact investor and grant money working together in a project where either you can get the grant outcome funders to provide some sort of a guarantee, first loss guarantee to the impact investors, which will really, I think, ensure that we get some of that capital onshore that we haven't been able to get, and it'll also help change a lot the way currently such projects are funded by NGOs, by grants, because your accountability increases when you have an impact investor overseeing or an AIF overseeing that project. Rahul, let me just bring you in terms of these conversations that we've been having with the regulators. Can you just help outline what the issues are and what changes are required? Rahul, are you on?
Audible?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Yes, thanks, Pratibha. So, taking along the points shared by Richie and Meyyappan. So, one fundamental issue that we still face is the issue of tax exemption certifications that non-profits have. By the current Finance Act, a recent amendment has been brought in wherein all existing non-profits that are in receipt of tax exemption will now have to reapply to seek reapplication and re-registration. Now, in a situation when we have a COVID-19 response where companies and MNCs and corporations are gearing up to accumulate their funds and then to deploy those funds towards non-profits for end users and end user beneficiaries, in a situation when the funds are already streamlined and has hit the account of respective NGOs and they have to reapply for such registration processes, and in case such registrations do not come by, the entire CSR bucket of these operations will have to take a hit. So that's first and foremost issue we have to immediately address, because 3 months from now, all the non-profit NGOs that exist currently in India and are tax exempt will have to restart this registration application again. And mind you, this entire registration application under the Income Tax Act is a cumbersome process. So on an immediate basis, we have to also understand the possible ramifications of this proposed law and how this is eventually going to impact our COVID-19 response in respect of how we are eventually going to use CSR contributions to reach out to the last mile users. Point number 2, in respect of FCRA as well, we do see a lot of challenges that foreign FCRA registered institutions face. The fact that India has the highest per capita NGOs and most of these NGOs operate in rural parts of India and has last mile outreach, it would be advisable for the government to allow further onward granting of those FCRA monies, despite not having FC registrations. Under the current law, an FCRA registered organization can only onward grant it to another FCRA registered organization. So this back and forth of onward granting does create a huge issue in light of the fact that we'll also have a lot of NGOs in poor states like northeastern states or Jharkhand or Bihar, where they may not be in receipt of FCRA. FCRA registration should be done away with, at least with respect to COVID response monies that would flow from corporations. The third point is also in respect of scalability. A lot of impact funding and blended finance that presently come into India, they also allow non-profits to use that money to diversify their income. But the moment they start diversifying it, income tax registration comes into question in respect of them triggering a certain financial threshold of a certain monetary limit. So we cannot hope to create an everlasting impact using CSR money or using grant money if we do not allow non-profits to scale up. And for that to happen, we have to enable non-profits to reach that threshold without fearing losing the tax exemption status, which the current law proposes to do. At the same time, debt funding, as Meyyappan and Richie spoke, and as Pratibha also pointed out, debt funding remains a challenge. Equity infusion into non-profit has always been a challenge. So we also have to look at different ways through which non-profits can diversify so as to create more everlasting impact. These are 3 or 4 important points that I thought we should, be more aware of, especially in respect of the immediate concern on the income tax registration that companies will have to face, non-profit companies.
Thanks, Rahul. In fact, most of the innovative structures that we are considering right now, where we are able to pool the impact investor money with some outcome funding from either offshore NGOs or onshore NGOs, all of them, the concern still remains of not having the regulatory clarity to be able to create those structures. We've been able to create some short-term structures to be able to provide funding, but they're cumbersome, they're time-consuming, and will require us to do a lot of paperwork. An easy way of doing that would be the reforms that you've talked about, where organizations are not worried about FCRA. A social venture fund that is allowed to take grant money, as Richie mentioned, is not worried about whether it needs to get an FCRA registration or not. And SVF, a social venture fund that is allowed to take grant money, is clearly allowed to take the tax exemptions that comes with taking money from a not-for-profit entity, and allowing and being ensured that if impact investors are providing funding on muted returns, or even in a scenario where there is no liquidity in the market, that they are able to take that first loss guarantee directly from from grant makers or CSR money, even being able to be utilized in social venture funds that are then onward lending for the purposes of COVID relief, for the purposes of providing liquidity in this market, either to SMEs or individuals that need it. As long as it is recognized as a social venture fund by SEBI and it's regulated by a financial services regulator such as SEBI, allowing such structures to be created will go a long way for the kind of panelists that we have today, for the kind of institutions, whether they're trade bodies or direct institutions, can really help move the needle in this regard. Amit Bhatia has joined us, so I'm just going to bring him in, and also Richa, to just help us know what, are these structures we are thinking about, because, we have, one organization like Michael and Susan Dead Foundation looking at them, or do you see a lot of demand for such innovative structures that we are talking about? And if you can just let us know what the mood is currently for both the impact investors and for grant makers for investing in Indian debt. Amit?
Hey, Pratibha, hi. And hey, look, I don't have anything specific to say on microcredit, but we do, I've been having a few conversations, and there is one idea on which all of you on the call can be very helpful. And, it's the same objective, just a different approach. So I think, so let me talk about one. Only this last Friday, we did a call with about 20 impact incubators, accelerators in India, everyone from the global players like NDA and Impact Hub and development agencies like USAID and GIZ and, Will Grows and Unlimited, etc. Everyone was represented there. And I think, and everyone was getting together to figure out how we can make this some opportunity at this crisis, because the forecast is, and a survey was done globally, including in India, that 40% up to 40% social enterprises may die, okay, as a result of this COVID-19, aftermath, up to 40%, which is quite a huge washout that could happen in the impact sector in India. So there were multiple ideas that came out.
It's a scary figure, Amit, yeah.
It's a survey that has just been put on the Andy website, Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. So take a look. But amongst the ideas that came out from this call, and then I'll come to an idea where all of you can help, were things like incubators, accelerators have to stop being generalists. They have to start specializing, an MSME, Economic Stabilization Fund, government moving to more meritocracy, through Atal Impact Mission. They have been giving 10 crores, but refuse to support high-performing people whom they have ever supported in the past. Government as a customer, more corporate engagement and, through CSR and, helping, mentor or own these incubators, accelerators, and creating exit plans. So all of this will be up on, LinkedIn by Wednesday, all the findings and these recommendations we were going to come out with. But I'm working on a separate idea, and I think NDA and all the impact investors on the call can be specifically helpful. Through one of my, foundations called Aspire Circle, which is home to 150, social leaders in India. So, it is chaired by Ila Ben Bhatt and, Geeta, for example, and Debashish of MSDF are fellows, as are several of the impact investors, who are part of IIC. And we've been working with Nandan Nilekhani's foundation, on called Societal Platforms, and thinking about a plan which is going to bring impact investment and cooperative structures together at district level in rural areas, so that we can provide long-term economic security, one, through, earnings, and second, through net asset creation for the long term. And I think this idea is still in early stages, and we've done a few calls and we're writing a plan. It's something where the idea is to think of both mass entrepreneurship in a way it can sit with government schemes, whether it is, the employment rural guarantee schemes or, other kind of schemes. How do you juxtapose them in a meaningful way that we, one, can get rid of this big migration crisis that India has? There are 300 million people, who work as migrant labor in India. So that we can do more balanced economic growth. And in that structure, and we're thinking through that structure, and that's where we need most help. And the plan that we are working on, which will go to Niti Aayog, is that every district level, if there were an SVF-like structure, And we are asking government that if they're going to put in all $100 billion, in this economic revival plan, even if they put $1 billion towards, as capital, that can go into these. We're not talking 1, 10, or 20. We're talking hundreds of their 700 districts. We don't know how many will come into focus. We know that we'll be pushed by Niti Aayog to focus only on 117 aspirational districts. But I think we're talking about hundreds of such to come, that in each district there's a SVF-like structure, which does more grassroots entrepreneurship, which creates livelihoods out there. And opposite that is a cooperative structure. And this is where we are still unclear, because through our independence history, we have brought the most poor out, and this may be surprising, actually through cooperative structures. Whether you think about dairy in Amul, or banking cooperatives, or agriculture producer cooperatives, or cooperative banks, we have used cooperative structure most effectively for 75 years to bring poor out of poverty. Now we're trying to think, what can this cooperative structure look like so the poor can be members and can build long-term assets and ownership through this. So this is a conversation we are doing with society, between Aspire Circle and societal platforms. And I think all of you are welcome to join in. And I think specifically, Pratibha, Richie, if you guys can help us think through how to create a structure that hundreds of these can be born. And we want to then be able to invite, all kind of impact investors or CSR, either to run the SVFs at district level or to run these cooperatives, manage these cooperatives at district level. So everyone in the country can participate in that economic revival. Rather, it's not, so it's a big plan being written. Now they're already on the societal platform. They have done lots of things, Nandan Nilekani already, and they have already given birth to 10 to 15 different initiatives, but right now it's privately funded by Nandan and some impact investors. But for example, cCep in education, or Avanti in micro credits are examples that they have built through these platforms. They want these platforms to be open source, open knowledge. And I think there is something, and the 5 sectors of focus here are going to be education, healthcare, affordable housing, financial inclusion, and food agriculture. So with all 5 is rural applications. So this is an effort, which we are trying to undertake, early conversations. But if you can help us crack this cooperative structure that can help the poor build over next 10 years significant assets, then I think we're talking about a game-changing national plan, which can bring impact investment to mainstream and actually put it at district level structure. So I'll just leave you with this. I work with a lot of people who love doing blue sky thinking. So this is a little bit of that, and don't just think of it that way. So thanks, Pratibha.
Thanks, Amit. That's actually really good to hear from you in terms of the initiative being taken, because that's a massive effort that you're talking about. And we would be happy to, of course, in whatever way we can help, we'd be more than happy to help. Nishith is also on the call. So, of course, he's a champion on blue sky thinking on these issues. But I mean, I can only start, like, while you were talking, I was thinking about 10 issues we would need to think about in terms of creating such structures. But we can take that offline. I just wanted to bring in Richa into the conversation. Richa, if you can just also help us understand, from you help raise funds from these impact investors. What is the mood that you're seeing? And again, what are the kind of demands and the structural demands that you're seeing from that segment?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Pratibha. As some of the panelists rightly said, there is a lot of demand for capital in various forms today. And, as Amit was mentioning, many of the companies that we see surviving and existing, especially in the microcredit space today, are beginning to struggle and being able to struggle in the terms of liquidity, in terms of raising capital, and then being able to pass it down to the ultimate borrower. So we will, and we expect to see a number of the earlier stage companies perhaps struggle, perhaps go out of capital. But what they're also going to need is a lot of support from existing investors in order to help them tide through this crisis. And we've seen many of the impact investors especially step up and help out, which is very encouraging to see. But apart from that, in terms of new capital going into these companies, that is something that we're seeing happen lesser and lesser, honestly. I think a lot of folks are taking the wait and watch approach. People are more focused on their existing portfolio companies and trying to get those companies out of any liquidity issues that currently are present. But there are a few investors that are open to looking at new transactions and facilitating those. Transactions that were in the midst of getting done, so those that had term sheets, we're actually seeing most of those go through. Investors haven't pulled out, at least most of them have not, some have, but most folks have not. We have not seen repricing, we've not seen renegotiation, which are all good signs and signs of good investors that are looking at it from a long-term perspective. But that being said, there are also deals that have broken out. I think what we're hoping to see is that as we come out of this lockdown, liquidity slowly starts easing into the system. We will certainly see companies needing capital, and there's going to be a massive rush into the markets to see who and when capital can be raised from.
And specifically around microcredit, Richa, are you seeing any structures being that we haven't seen yet or haven't discussed here yet?
No, I think most folks have realized that while equity is one part of it, and you want to raise equity, it's becoming tougher to raise in these markets just because of the many distractions, as well as the as I mentioned, the likelihood of success seems something folks are questioning. So the need for debt funds has certainly come up, and as Rahil mentioned, MSDF is working on it. Media is working on these things. So there are a bunch of the impact investors that are working on these creative instruments, which is the need of the hour, and especially those where decisions can be made quickly and capital can be pumped in sooner than it would take otherwise.
Sure. Thanks so much, Richa, for that insight. I think I'm just seeing questions being posted on the board. So let me also start taking some of the questions.
Pratibha, is it okay? Can I just couple of points I wanted to make?
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a very interesting conversation because, I think 70% of the conversation has been about how to manage around CSR, grant, FCRA, and I think, maybe in a more BAU scenario, I think it's okay for us to expend some time and effort on that. But in the kind of scenario of crisis that we are in, I think this is maybe a great opportunity for us to be able to hopefully petition the government for some easing, at least in the short run of, say, next 6 months, in terms of some of these sort of walls between philanthropy, CSR, as well as impact investing. Because, we've spent, as you're aware, Pratibha, maybe 80% of the time trying to figure out how to make the transaction work. That time may have been better used in fact, looking for more investors, going out and reaching out to a large number of people to try and get the funds in, which would have obviously added a lot more value to the transaction. So maybe I think you mentioned that point at during the conversation. Maybe a good time to go to Ministry of Finance and kind of request and SEBI to see, and I don't know whether this includes the Charities Commissioner or God knows who else, to see whether there can be some harmonization of some of this, at least for a short sort of a window, in case they feel that these are larger decisions, so that we can really scale up some of these initiatives to a level where they because as we are aware, we had a conversation I think last Friday, a similar Nishith Desai call, where we had some of the large investors from the diaspora in the US and other countries. I mean, they have their own challenges of bringing in funds. So I think that's something maybe, independent of the microcredit story, I think somewhere trying to get something moving on those lines, Pratibha, will be a huge value, because then we can kind of spend more time on the ground trying to get the investors onto the table. That's just a small point I wanted to make. I think you did mention it, but I just thought I'll make a point again.
No, absolutely. I think liberalization of regulation is going to be the mantra that the government will have to follow very quickly for us to be, to ensure, organizations like, Death Foundation or Meteor organizations that Amit are working with, so that, time is not wasted there. Nishith, I'll give you concluding remarks. I'll just take up a few questions. I think along the lines of, what Ramraj was also just saying, some comments that we have. I think, Professor Sudarshan on call, and he's raised a couple of meaningful points. I think one of them is, instead of creating an environment where we are getting all these NGOs to get funding, we've got exemptions only for the PM CARES Fund. That's something that even we've recognized. Rahul, Nishith, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I don't have concluding comments, but I'm intruding in I was not a scheduled speaker and just wanted to be in listen mode, but couldn't resist my temptation to speak a word or two. I think it's a great idea. And if you all think, because today we are running out of time, we have just about 2 minutes to go. So if this looks good, I think today was a brilliant discussion, and Amit and Joy and everyone, you brought to the table so many ideas. And now we have a platform. Today also we had Suresh Prabhu come to talk to us for an hour. He spoke, and so we can all get people on the platform. And if everybody agrees, then we can have one more round of the type today, because I think everybody came up with so many ideas. Now we have to take it to logical solution. Actually, ministers should come to us. We shouldn't have to rush to them. Okay, that should be the new world. And so I'm sure we'll try to do something. And if you can get right people for the discussion, it would be very good. But if you all think this is a good idea, we'll try our best in the next week, and or whenever it's convenient to all of you, because the momentum that has started last week with the Indian diaspora and others coming on board, and then this second one in this sequence, I think we have covered a lot of mileage today, and maybe one more session would be helpful, or many more, whatever you want to. So we can now begin to actually discuss concrete ideas and focus on few of them and take it in a logical session. But I just want to thank everybody for coming on board. I'm sorry for being an intrusive speaker. And
Never You're always giving us inspiration, Nishith bhai. So I think people would be happy to hear we are trying to work with IIC to ensure that we get some of these inputs to the ministries, whichever relevant ministries that these need to go to. So if there is something further that needed to be added, please do write to us, and we'll try and push that through too. Khaled, are we over with time, or can we extend, because some of the questions?
One person to speak, no? Sudarshan, somebody, I don't know.
Pratibha, I think we'll just take up Mr. Sudarshan's query. He had two queries, essentially, one on the innovative financing part, which I'll request Meyyappan to take. I'll take on the PM CARES Fund query that he had. On that query, today Supreme Court jumped a petition which was filed by way of a PIL, which had argued about the constitutionality of having set up PM CARES Fund. And while the Supreme Court debunked that petition, the petition was debunked on the ground that it was argued that no specific notification or gazette circular were issued before setting up that fund. However, the issue of the propriety of how the federal structure is to be seen still is a very debatable issue, and that's a very genuine issue, for the reason that while PM CARES Fund under CSR Schedule 7 allows donors to seek deductions on donations that they make, the same facility is then not extended to funds of similar nature which are set up either by state governments or different agencies, and also happen to fall within the ambit of Schedule 7 of the Companies Act. So to that extent, we do see a genuine concern that state governments have voiced out in terms of depletion of funds at their end or non-commitment of funds at their end by way of companies that operate in those states in comparison to the kind of funds that the central government is currently receiving by way of CSR contribution under PM CARES Fund. The issue is both political as well as legal. On the legal front, we do see a reasonable scope of argument in terms of saying that this certainly does not go in line with the federal structure. But I think this issue is more political than legal at this point. I'll also request Meyyappan to speak, share his views on the innovative financing mechanism which Mr. Sudarshan wanted to know more about.
Thanks, Rahul. So I think the question was, is there any specific innovation that's arisen in the context of COVID specifically, apart from what Mr. Sudarshan was saying, that is aware to people in the impact investment space? So I think there are a couple of mandates that we are doing for a few clients where we have tried to push the boundaries on what is legally doable, in the sense that, as Pratibha was saying, there are a lot of different laws that apply, CSR laws, tax laws, AIF regulations, FCRA. So we have had to harmonize several things depending on the scale and scope of different structures. But I think we have reached the limit of trying to achieve consensus in these gray areas between the regulators and clients and get them comfortable that a structure is legal. I think we have actually, between a technology and some of the new things that we have come up with, some clients have started rolling out stuff specifically for COVID situation. But nevertheless, I think the true potential remains untapped, as we are hearing across the board from everyone, that there are still too many restrictions to completely achieve what the parties want to do. And to that extent, there are several laws that need to be amended or special dispensations required. And it's not just one ministry, it's several ministries. So that's something that we will be working towards in the coming days.
Thanks, Maya. We also have some other questions, but unfortunately we're running out of time. If you can write to us directly, we'll try and ensure that we answer your queries. Thank you very much, everyone. I will hand over to my colleague Khaled to close the discussions for today.
Thank you so much, PJ. And I would like to thank everyone, all the participants, as well as our panelists, for such an informative session. And I would also like to inform all our participants about the upcoming session, which is at 9 p.m. tonight. How to set up a cryptocurrency exchange in India. It will be at 9 p.m. tonight. And tomorrow at 3 p.m. we have an interesting session on how to obtain funding for arbitrations in India. So that will be at 3 p.m. tomorrow. You can also look up on our website as well as on our LinkedIn for further details. Thank you so much for joining in, and you may now disconnect your lines. Thank you.